poor girl is humiliated for getting a word wrong, but the millionaire stands up and says, "And I made a much bigger mistake." And what he reveals next changes the course of the room. The laughter started out soft, but soon echoed off the marble walls of the conference room. Emily, a young, plain-looking intern, had just mispronounced the word entrepreneur in front of a packed audience of executives. "Yeah, on premise." "Oh, honey," one of the partners mocked, while others choked on their coffee. To hide their mockery, one of the directors blurted out, "She can't even speak, let alone work here." The internal cameras recorded everything. Emily lowered her eyes, trying to hold back tears, while the company's millionaire CEO, sitting at the head of the table, crossed his arms in silence. No one expected him to say anything. But then, slowly, he pushed back his chair, stood up, and in a firm voice said, "If they laugh at her for a pronunciation mistake, maybe they should laugh at me too. Because the mistake I made almost destroyed my entire life." The silence that followed the CEO's speech was absolute. Everyone was waiting for some kind of scolding or an attempt to defend the intern. But what came next shook the room to its core. He looked directly at Emily, then at the other executives and said, 20 years ago I signed a document that evicted my own mother from the house where she lived, all out of greed. I lost the right to call her mother because of a clause I didn't even read properly." Faces went pale. Some tried to process it, others barely breathed. Emily, uncomprehending, just listened. Then he turned to her and added, "She was the strongest woman I've ever known. And from what I just saw here, she would be very proud of you." What no one there knew was that Emily was hiding a past directly linked to that same mistake. And when the truth comes out, everyone will wish they'd never laughed. Before continuing, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and like this video so you can continue receiving our real stories. Thank you very much. The morning heat seeped through the glass windows of the 47th floor as Emily straightened the collar of her worn blazer and took a deep breath for the 5th time in less than 2 minutes. It was her first day of official reporting at Rosedale and Kingsley, one of the largest investment holding firms on the East Coast. The marble walls and the silence, punctuated by steady heels, created an atmosphere where the air seemed thicker, as if each breath from someone important cost $100. She carried a blue folder with handwritten notes, as the tablet her mother had given her before she passed away hadn't turned on for weeks. Even so, she had studied until 2 in the morning. He knew the numbers, the client names, the company's history. She just wasn't prepared for the stares. As soon as she entered the conference room, everyone stared at her. She wore understated but clean clothing. Her hair tied back with a cloth elastic gave away that she wasn't an insider. The marketing director exchanged a mocking glance with the finance assistant. The oval table held 18 people, all in impeccable suits, smart bracelets, and a gleam in their eyes that seemed made of stainless steel. Emily just smiled, trying to hide the pressure in her chest. The CEO, Mr. Alexander Graves, hadn't yet entered. They said he only showed up when something truly important was about to happen. His presence was rarer than rain in August, but his name loomed over everything like a shadow with a golden signature. As the meeting began, the HR manager introduced the new talent. Emily was last. When her name was mentioned, she stood up slowly. Each step toward the screen was a challenge. The lights dimmed and the projector came on. Her presentation would focus on a project she'd been studying for 3 months, an incubation model for local startups with social impact. But as she opened her mouth and began, the tension made her stumble over the very word she'd practiced most the night before. Entrepreneur. A dry laugh echoed from the corner. "It's entrepreneur, dear. If you're going to sell ideas, at least learn to speak like a grown-up," the branding manager commented. The laughter came in waves, followed by whispers and low glances, not out of respect, but rather ill-concealed contempt. Emily felt her throat tighten. That's when the door opened, and like an abrupt cut-in. A movie, the figure of Alexander Graves appeared, tall, clean-shaven, and wearing a tailored suit that seemed to have been designed in silence. The laughter ceased. He walked slowly to the end of the table, not looking at anyone. Only then, in a calm voice, did he say, "Go on." Emily tried to continue, but her embarrassment was evident. Her hands were shaking, and her voice was cracking. The projector had shut down due to a system glitch. She simply lowered her eyes and said, "Sorry, I prepared myself, but—" Then Alexander Graves slowly pushed back his chair, stood and said, "If you think saying a word defines who someone is, then maybe you should laugh at me too." The room froze. Emily looked up slowly, uncomprehending. The CEO was looking at her, but there was something there, recognition, a kind of antique mirror. And at that moment, the story began that no one in that room would forget, not because of a mispronunciation, but because something was about to be unearthed, something that connected the mistakes of a millionaire with the silent pain of an invisible girl. Emily never knew her father. She grew up in rented trailers, with her mother working 3 shifts as a hospital cleaner, seamstress, and caregiver. When asked about family, she simply said, "It's just the 2 of us, but we manage." At 8, she taught herself to cook. By 9, she could read contracts better than many adults because her mother taught her to be wary of papers with small print. She had a natural talent for numbers, but a deep fear of making mistakes in public. The first time she raised her hand in school, she was mocked by her teacher. Since then, she preferred to get it right in silence. At 13, she saw her mother faint for the first time in the bathroom. The water was running, steam covered the tiles, and her body was there, lying on the cold floor. The diagnosis was relentless, an aggressive tumor, with no chance of surgery. Still, her mother didn't stop working. Emily dropped out of school for a year to care for her. Years later, she returned with a full scholarship thanks to an NGO that welcomed young caregivers. She worked as a waitress, a delivery woman, and a shoe saleswoman. She slept little, read a lot. She saved old newspapers, highlighted difficult words, and memorized entire entries. During this time, something in her heart grew, a silent anger toward those who had everything and pretended they deserved it. Not out of envy, but out of justice. Emily didn't want to be rich. She wished her mother hadn't died alone in a tiny hospital room, while executives with powerful surnames bought up entire hospitals like clockwork. There was a letter her mother left, but she never had the courage to open it. The handwriting was firm, the envelope sealed with tape. Emily kept it at the bottom of her backpack, as if keeping the last piece of her intact. When she passed the Rosedale and Kingsley selection process, she didn't tell anyone. She joined as an administrative intern, but she already knew the firm's structure better than many managers. She knew the partners, the founders, and the major scandals that had been hushed up over the years. She knew the name of a former lawyer, and she also knew about a document signed 20 years ago that destroyed the life of a humble woman. But she didn't talk about it. Yet. She kept everything bottled up, as always. She knew how to wait. She was a girl no one noticed, but who knew pain like someone carrying an invisible knife stuck in their back. It wasn't revenge I wanted, it was balance. And when I saw the right eyes, I would know when to speak. Because she hadn't forgotten the name on that paper, or the icy signature that accompanied it. And that name was exactly the same one that now commanded the table where everyone had humiliated her. By the 3rd week of the internship, word had spread through the halls with the speed typical of corporate intrigue. There would be a surprise pitch among the new interns, and the best project would be directly sponsored by the executive committee. But what no one said openly, only whispered in the elevators or while getting coffee, was that it was nothing more than a cynical competition. The veterans bet among themselves which intern would make the biggest blunder, and how long it would take for someone to cry. The prize was a symbolic spot on an innovation committee that never approved anything. But what mattered wasn't the project, but the spectacle. And Emily, with her hand-scribbled notebooks, country accent, and scuffed shoes, was the strongest bet this time. One of the directors bet $200 that she'd say something wrong within the first 2 minutes. Another said that, by the looks of it, she wouldn't even be able to turn on the projector. The jokes were understated but cutting. The charity case is going to be a blast tonight. I bet her PowerPoint is in Comic Sans font. Emily knew. He'd accidentally overheard part of the conversation in one of the bathrooms. He recognized the voices of the branding manager and another executive. He didn't cry. He simply returned to his desk and that early morning revised his presentation 10 times. He knew that if he messed up, there would be no one to defend him. The company didn't care about true merit. It cared about looks, surnames, who was part of the circle. She wasn't of that world. But still, he decided to try. She chose a topic she knew well: social startups created by young people from peripheral communities and how the company could incubate them to generate profit and impact. Simple, direct, yet powerful. Her project was real, with data, names of young people she knew, honest graphs. But all they expected from her was to stumble, and deep down perhaps she knew that was what they wanted. She knew they were laughing before she even began. At the presentation, the other interns each had 5 minutes. Some made mistakes. One forgot his flash drive. Another confused the quarterly numbers, but no one was ridiculed like she was. As soon as Emily stepped up to the podium and opened the slide, the silence was broken by condescending smiles. When she read the project title, Regenerative Entrepreneurship in Urban Communities, one of the partners whispered, "Let's see if she can pronounce that." She swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and began. But in the first sentence, when she tried to say entrepreneur, the word slipped off her tongue. An ancient nervousness took over. She hesitated. Entrepren. The laughter erupted, and the manager, with a cynical smile, said loudly enough, "Yeah, on premise, dear." The room turned into a cruel theater, and that was the moment the bet was won. The operations director discreetly slapped his colleague's palm in celebration. "And Emily!" Emily stood there, her eyes wet, the projector glitchy, and an audience hungry for glitches. What no one knew was that she hadn't made a mistake because she didn't know, but because she was trying not to tremble as she looked at that name engraved in the wood of the main table. Alexander Graves. A name she had known for much longer than anyone there could have imagined. Emily and Alexander Graves's first meeting happened as silently as everything else that mattered in her life. After the presentation crumbled under suppressed laughter and judgmental stares, she still tried to finish her speech. She briefly discussed the social impact of startups, mentioned inclusion data, and quoted a sentence from the letter her mother had written, still unaware of its full content. And then she lowered her head, ready to return to her chair as if nothing had been worth it. But before she could take the first step, Alexander stood up. The room, until then distracted by his own wickedness, fell silent instantly. He walked slowly, without looking directly at her, picked up the projector remote, and turned it back on. With a quick click, he opened the first slide of Emily's project. Silently he read the main points. Then, still without raising his voice, he said, "Who here knows what entrepreneurship in essence? Because if it's just about knowing how to pronounce it, then half of this class is unemployed." Everyone swallowed hard. Emily froze. Alexander finally looked at her, and his eyes, an almost icy grey, conveyed neither anger nor pity, just an absurd attention, a direct focus, something between curiosity and a recognition. It was as if, in some inexplicable way, he knew this girl knew more than she let on, and perhaps he knew she knew something about him. For the rest of the meeting, Emily remained silent, but something had changed. Alexander asked questions about the project, asked her to send the complete data, and praised her use of numbers. To the others, it seemed like a simple gesture of compassion or social correctiveness, but Emily sensed there was more to it. Because when she mentioned the word regenerative, his eyes narrowed briefly, like someone hearing a familiar term from a place they'd rather keep buried. In the following days, she noticed him watching her silently, not invasively, but inquisitively, as if trying to understand why he felt disconcerted by her presence. And in one of the hallways, when she accidentally bumped into him on her way out of the company library, he simply said, "You remind me of someone." Emily didn't answer. She just smiled with her lips, not her eyes. And in that moment, an invisible tension formed between them. A bridge to the past neither of them was ready to cross yet. But he noticed in that brief moment that she was carrying an old envelope in her backpack. Yellowed, sealed with a ribbon. And without knowing why, that made him pause for 2 seconds, as if time had slowed down. Something inside him whispered a name, but he pushed it away. It couldn't be, but it was. And Emily knew exactly what she was doing. Because for the first time, it wasn't her being watched, it was him. The public humiliation came like a smiling blade. It didn't need to be shouted to cut. The morning after the presentation, someone from the internal media team posted an edited clip of Emily's speech on the company's private channel. With the sarcastic caption, "Social pitch with optional dictionary," the part where she stumbled over the word entrepreneur had been replayed in slow motion, interspersed with laughing emojis. It wasn't an accidental mistake, it was a message. In less than 2 hours, the video was circulating through informal emails, closed WhatsApp groups among employees, and even among some internal clients. Emily, upon entering the cafeteria, felt the stares before even seeing the screens. A group of analysts looked at her and whispered, followed by a muffled laugh. An IT employee feigned a stumble, saying, Entrepreneur what?" And the others burst out laughing. She took a deep breath and kept walking. The branding manager, the one who had loudly mocked her during the presentation, walked past her and said with a fake smile, "Don't worry, honey. Everyone embarrasses themselves at first. They're just not usually as memorable." Emily clenched her fists. Anger rose, but she swallowed it. As always, she knew that to retaliate was to lose. Her silence was a weapon. In the break room, 2 interns were discussing the video loud enough for her to hear. "If I were her, I would have quit yesterday." How embarrassing. Emily simply walked past them. She didn't respond. Deep down, she felt something even deeper than shame. It was the memory of her mother being ridiculed by nurses when she confused technical terms during chemotherapy. It was the same laughter, the same kind of people, but the cruelest part was yet to come. That afternoon, Alexander Graves called all the interns together for a quick meeting. No one knew why. Emily arrived last. When she entered the room, the silence was awkward. Alexander looked at her, and his gaze was different. No longer neutral, it was suspicious. On the table was a printed copy of the email containing the video link. He asked without raising his voice, "Does anyone know who started this?" Everyone shook their heads like good corporate idiots. Alexander studied their faces for a few seconds and then fixed his eyes on Emily. And he said, for all to hear, "I've made mistakes far bigger than pronunciation. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that there's no room for cowards at the top. So if anyone here thinks it's funny to expose other people's failures, have the courage to sign what you share." The message was delivered. But in that moment, even with the apparent protective gesture, Emily realized he was uncomfortable with her presence, with the envelope in his backpack, and even more so, with what he was beginning to sense but couldn't yet prove. The humiliation didn't break her, it only reinforced her silence. Because now she knew he was alert, and Shibusen was exactly where she wanted to be. 2 days after the incident, when the dust seemed to have settled, and the laughter had once again disappeared behind coffee cups and soulless meetings, Emily made a decision. She arrived at the office early, before the lights came on, before the air conditioning even started blowing. She sat alone in the empty conference room, the same one where she'd been mocked, and waited. At 7:21 a.m., Alexander Graves walked in. He had his headphones on, reading something on his tablet. He hadn't expected to see her there. He stopped when he saw her sitting at the head of the table. She calmly stood up and said, "Can we talk?" Her tone was firm, without hesitation. He removed his headphones, curious. Something about her was different from that insecure intern. Her gaze was now straight, steady, almost heavy. Emily pulled the old envelope from her backpack and placed it on the table. Alexander stared at it as if seeing a ghost folded in paper. She didn't explain anything immediately. She simply opened the envelope. She took out a yellowed, handwritten letter. The silence between them was almost physical. This letter was written 20 years ago by the bravest woman I have ever known. She placed the letter before him. He didn't touch it, but his eyes scanned the first few lines and stopped at the end where the shaky signature read, "Love, Rose." His heart raced. Alexander recoiled as if he'd been slapped. Emily stared at him. "Did you know this woman, Mr. Graves?" He tried to compose himself, but he couldn't lie. "Yes, a long time ago." She nodded. "She was my mother." Alexander's face went white. Memories came rushing back. The eviction proceedings, the fight with his partners, the signature he'd given without reading it completely, believing it was just a formality. Rose had been thrown out with a cold letter. He never saw her again. Years later, he discovered she'd died. But I didn't know I had. "A daughter," Emily continued. "She said one of the men who hurt her wasn't evil, just a coward. She said he was brilliant deep down, that maybe one day he'd understand what he'd done." Alexander couldn't say anything. He just sat. His eyes were watery, but he held them steady. Emily kept the letter, not as a threat, but as proof that she knew everything. "I joined this company on merit, but I stayed because of this." She didn't smile. She didn't accuse. She just looked him in the eye. "I don't want revenge. I don't need it. I've seen good people die with dignity, and powerful people live without peace." Before leaving the room, she turned and added, "I didn't misspell the word. I just trembled. But you misspelled the name of a woman who only wanted respect." And with that he left the empty envelope on the table, a silent reminder. Alexander stood there for minutes, motionless. The past had returned, but for the first time, with living eyes. Alexander didn't go to the office the next day, or the day after that. For the first time in years, he skipped a shareholder meeting and ignored invitations to corporate events he normally treated as sacred. He spent his mornings sitting in the rooftop garden of his building, reading and rereading the letter from Rose, the woman he'd evicted without remorse, believing he was merely fulfilling a cold-blooded clause. But now those words took on a scent, a warmth, and a face. And the face was Emily's. He sifted through old files. He reviewed past contracts, archived emails, forgotten reports, and then he found it. A silent eviction lawsuit from 20 years ago, signed by him with the board's pen. One of the many lawsuits that had passed through his hands, filled with anonymous names. But that name now throbbed, Rose Turner. At the time, Rose had filed a desperate petition asking for another 30 days at the property. He was undergoing treatment and had a young daughter. The request was denied, for him. The legal opinion recommended speed. The property was in the name of the holding company, and a new administrative headquarters would be built there. What he didn't know, or pretended not to know, was that that address was all Rose had. Now, looking at the dates, documents, and reports, Alexander noticed a detail. The new headquarters project was never built on that land. The decision was reversed by another CEO months later. The site remained empty for 3 years before being sold to a smaller company. In other words, all that haste hadn't just been bureaucratic, it had been cruel. He called the former legal director. No one answered. He combed through impact reports. He found in a 2003 appendix an internal opinion that stated, "Tenant Rose Turner is in terminal condition. Immediate eviction is recommended." That was it. Her name had been turned into a term, tenant. Alexander closed his eyes. It was him. He had done it. Signed. Ignored. Moved on. And now the result was before him, in the form of a girl. With hard eyes and measured words. She didn't shout. She didn't demand. She didn't process him. She just existed. And that, for him, was unbearable. That night, Alexander went to the headquarters of the NGO Emily had mentioned in her presentation. He sat on one of the benches in the back during an event for young entrepreneurs, and there, amidst dreamy voices and simple presentations, he saw her. Emily, on stage, unaware he was there, was talking about the importance of not giving up, even when Everything is designed to make you believe you don't belong. She quoted her own mother. She spoke of nights spent caring for her and how silence teaches more than words. I learned that getting a word wrong never hurt me as much as hearing someone laugh at someone who tries. Because those who laugh at someone else's effort are probably afraid to try. Alexander felt a lump in his throat. The truth had found him, not as revenge, but as a mirror. And in that reflection, for the first time, he saw who he truly was. On Monday, Emily didn't show up, nor on Tuesday. Her badge still registered access to the building, but no one saw her in the hallways. Her computer had been turned off. Her desk was empty. Only a small vase with an artificial flower remained beside the monitor. A sunflower she had brought on her first day to remind me that even concrete can give birth to light, as she said with a smile. Now, the sunflower felt like a goodbye. Alexander, noticing her absence, tried to hide his unease. He asked the HR team where she was. They said only that Emily had requested personal leave and asked not to be contacted. He nodded, as if he didn't care. But her absence seemed to spread through the floor like a muffled echo. Something had changed. He began searching for her without even saying he was looking. He logged into the internal system, accessed contacts and addresses. He called the NGO, but was told she was in a silent period. He visited the neighborhood where she had mentioned growing up, but no one knew where she was. Emily had simply disappeared from view, and her silence began to become unbearable. Alexander walked around the company like a shadow of his former self. He ignored meetings, missed deadlines, and left important decisions in the hands of others. And amidst the luxury of the penthouse, the expensive trophies, and the award-winning paintings, everything seemed weightless. Because that girl, with her erect posture and steady eyes, had left something inside him that no amount of money could erase, a sense of debt, not financial, moral, human. At night he tried to sleep and couldn't. Every now and then he would open Rose's letter and read it quietly. It hurt, like an involuntary confession. Her mother's words echoed, "Maybe one day he will understand what he did." But understanding wasn't enough, and Alexander knew it. He had to face it, not others, himself. One night, while reviewing old emails sent by company employees, he found one Emily had sent him directly the previous month. He had never read it. The subject line read, "Idea for new community headquarters, please consider." In the body of the email, she enclosed a restructuring plan to repurpose an old piece of company land, the same land he had taken from Rose. Emily wanted to transform the site into a free educational center for low-income young entrepreneurs. The project's name, Sunflower Project. Alexander felt the ground give way. She had left it all there. The plan, the intention, the forgiveness whispered by an idea. And he didn't answer, because he had never read it. Now she was gone. And what remained was a silence that screamed louder than any apology. Emily's absence wasn't just noticed, it was felt. And what began as silence turned into a murmur, then a whisper, then outrage. One of the company's internal videos, featuring the clip of her humiliation, the one previously shared mockingly, was leaked on social media by an anonymous employee. But what turned the mockery into commotion was what came with the video. A post written by someone from the NGO where Emily worked, revealing her journey, her dedication to her sick mother, her effort to study, and the most powerful detail, her mother's letter, the story of the eviction, and the name of Alexander Graves, discreetly connected to the tragedy. In less than 24 hours, the video had racked up millions of views. The caption was harsh. She just wanted to say one word, but they tried to take away her entire voice. Media outlets began investigating. Stories appeared with headlines like "The Invisible Intern and the Granite Empire" and "When Silence Bleeds, the Untold Story of the Mother, Dumped by a CEO." Alexander Graves' name became associated not with innovation or visionary leadership, but with the coldness of an ancient decision that now returned with sharp teeth. Public pressure mounted. Investors began to question the company's reputation. his once submissive colleagues now avoided, meeting him in the elevator. At meetings, there was an awkward silence whenever his name was mentioned. The executive committee demanded an official statement, but Alexander refused to outsource an apology. That's when he decided to speak, alone. In an auditorium packed with staff, journalists, and cameras, he took the stage and said, "I don't come here to deny anything. I come to confess. I signed a paper 20 years ago. I didn't care about the name. I didn't care about the pain. I just kept going, as so many do. But that name was Rose, and that pain created a daughter named Emily, and I failed them both." The silence was absolute. Some were moved. Others looked away, as if they too carried small, dormant guilt. But the impact was made. The man who once seemed untouchable now stood naked before the world, without walls. The next day, headlines read, "Millionaire asks for public forgiveness for past mistake that destroyed a family." But Emily didn't appear, nor did she respond. And that absence hurt more than 1,000 condemnations. What followed that public speech wasn't a scandal. It was an awkward silence that permeated the company's corridors, boardroom meetings, and even the bulletproof glass gates of Alexander's mansion. He wasn't cancelled, but he wasn't forgiven either. He was forgotten in mid-air. People stopped fawning. Greetings became automatic. The glow that once preceded his entrance was now just presence. Alexander started arriving at work earlier. He traded his Italian suits for street clothes. He began walking the lower floors where he rarely set foot. He observed people in silence. He noticed those who carried pain hidden behind badges. He realized that the company he ran was full of Emilys, full of silent people who swallowed the world to avoid losing their jobs. He returned to the old lot where it all began, the same one with the dump, the one Emily had mentioned as the future community center. It was abandoned, surrounded by rusty fences. Weeds were overtaking him. He spent hours there, walking alone among rocks, dry leaves, and construction debris. And then the cleanup began. He ordered the area fenced off. He gathered engineers and architects and demanded that the Sunflower Project come to fruition, exactly as Emily had planned. Her words, her plans, without his signature. He donated the land in Emily's mother's name, publicly, without a press office. He also sent Emily a handwritten letter. It simply said, "You gave me a chance to look in the mirror. I can't give back what I took, but I can become someone who honors what you represent, not to clear my name, but to try to earn the silence you gave me." Alexander stepped down as CEO and joined an anonymous mentoring project with young community entrepreneurs. At every event he attended, he refused the microphone. He didn't give speeches. He just listened. The media stopped following him. The company's shares fluctuated, then stabilized. The controversy was a thing of the past. But for Alexander, nothing was ever the same again. In the solitude of his days, he began to cultivate sunflowers on the terrace of his apartment. One a month, each one named after someone he knew but didn't see at the time. And though the crowd had forgotten, her name still echoed in everything he did. Emily. The reunion took place on a cloudy, almost invisible day. Alexander had been invited to a low-key grand opening, the official opening of the educational center on Rose's former site. It wasn't a grand ceremony, nor was it televised. Just a gathering of young people, a few families, volunteers, and local teachers. He arrived without fanfare. He wore simple clothes, was unshaven, and carried a small wooden box. As he entered through the side gate, no one immediately recognized him, and he preferred it that way. He walked through the freshly painted hallways, seeing rooms with modest computers, handwritten chalkboards, and a bookshelf filled with used books, all donated. In the community cafeteria, a tribute mural stood out, photos of young people who had participated in the pilot project. In the center of the mural, an enlarged black and white image, a woman with a tired but firm gaze, Rose Turner. And just below, a phrase written in gold letters, "Courage is the silence that does not bow." Alexander stopped there, his eyes welled up, and it was at that moment that he saw her. Emily, with her back turned, organizing teaching materials on a table. Her hair tied in a loose bun, she wore jeans and a simple dress shirt. She was talking to a group of teenagers. She was laughing. Her face was a different color. The weight on her shoulders was gone. He hesitated. For a second, he considered leaving. Perhaps it would be best not to disturb the peaceful atmosphere. But then one of the young men accidentally bumped into him and said, "Oh, it's Mr. Graves, isn't it? She mentioned you." Emily turned. Her eyes met his. 1 second, 2, 3. Too long to be casual, and too short to contain everything there. She walked slowly toward him. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just looked at him, as if measuring who he was now, not who he had been. "It's beautiful here," he said, breaking the silence. She nodded. "Yes, it is." Alexander handed her the small wooden box. "It's my mother's. It's been stored away for many years. I thought it should be here." Emily opened it. Inside was an antique chain, a simple ring, and a photograph of herself at 5 years old in her mother's arms, a copy Rose had left behind unbeknownst to her. Emily didn't cry, but her eyes trembled. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Neither do I see myself here," he replied. They were silent for a moment. Then she said, "The past doesn't change, Mr. Graves, but what we build from it, it may not feel like forgiveness. But it can be something better." He nodded. And in that moment, there was no reconciliation, no final apology, just presence. And sometimes that's all you need to start rewriting what once seemed destined to hurt forever. Emily walked to the mural of her mother's face and stood there, as if silently conversing with someone still breathing between the lines of time. Alexander watched her from afar without pressure, without expectation. He simply waited, as if every second she delayed was part of a judgment he accepted. She then returned to him with calm, almost solemn steps. She stopped before him, and for a moment he thought she might say something definitive, a word that would either free him or condemn him. But she simply handed him a new white envelope. No name written on it, no symbol. He took it carefully but didn't open it. "You'll understand when you read it. But not now," she said. "Save it. Read it when you feel ashamed again. Not guilty. Shame. Because that's when the man reappears." Alexander swallowed hard. His heart pounded. He wanted to ask what was going on there. He wanted to know if this was a final goodbye or just another step on a path he could no longer foresee. But she gave no answers. Emily then extended her hand, a simple gesture. He squeezed, feeling her fingers firm, alive, present. There was warmth. There was distance. But there was also dignity. "I'm not going back to your company," she said, looking him in the eye. "I don't need this anymore. And neither do you." Alexander nodded. He understood. He wouldn't insist. She didn't want to climb glass stairs with golden names. "I wanted to plant roots in concrete and see sunflowers sprout in places where before there was only stone. If you ever want to talk, you know where to find me. But come as a person, not as a symbol." And with that, she turned and walked back to the cafeteria. She sat down with the young people, opened a notebook and began teaching them about community microcredit. Alexander stood there, the envelope in his hands. He knew that, whatever its contents, it sealed something greater than forgiveness. It sealed a choice. She didn't want revenge. She wanted him to live with the weight of his conscience until he turned it into action. And he was willing. That night, Alexander climbed alone to the rooftop of his apartment building. The Manhattan sky was hazy, and the city light seemed more distant than ever. The envelope was still sealed in his hands. He placed it on the table, next to a slowly cooling mug of tea. He wasn't going to open it yet. She had asked. And this time, he would obey. In the center of the terrace was a bed of sunflowers. They grew silently, facing the rising sun, even though there was no light at the moment. It was a habit he'd cultivated since Emily's disappearance, a symbolic gesture that now took shape. He knelt before them. He placed his hand on the ground. He took a deep breath. He wasn't a man accustomed to begging for forgiveness on his knees, but it wasn't a request. It was something else. It was an acknowledgement. Beside him, on the wooden bench, lay a photograph. The same image he had seen in the box, Rose holding a baby Emily. On the back of the photo he had written just 4 words. I should have seen. The wind blew stronger. One of the sunflowers swayed as if bowing its head slightly. Alexander didn't cry. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel in control. He felt human. Then he stood, walked to the edge of the terrace, and saw the city lights pulsing below. He thought of how many stories he had ignored, how many faces had passed him by, unseen, and how many more would pass by without him being able to do anything. But Emily was no longer invisible. She was a present absence, an open wound that blossomed. He returned to the table, carefully picked up the envelope, and tucked it inside a book. One day he would read it, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. And there, on that moonless night, while the world continued to rush by below, a man stood silently among the sunflowers. No music played, no voice narrated. But the scene said it all. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched something deep inside you. So tell me in the comments, what was the part that struck you the most? I read everything and respond to the most compelling ones. Please leave a like. It really helps the channel continue telling stories worth hearing. If you're not already subscribed, subscribe now and activate the bell, because there's much more to come. And hey, the video that appears here will give you goosebumps. Click now and watch it. You'll understand why some scars change everything,